So we just make sure, one, that we don't knock anything down inside the cooler, and secondly, that those seating surfaces are nice and clean. And then we can do the same on the engine case itself. Again, you need to be careful that you're not going to knock anything down. Remember that the Volkswagen only has a strainer and not an oil filter as such in the standard form. Well, it's really important that you don't force anything down here, but it's so important as well that that surface is absolutely clean, and we strongly recommend doing an oil change after doing this job anyway, just in case you've dropped any little bits of grot down into the case. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is just have a quick double check on this, just get the oil off so that you can see it. And these are designed to compress down obviously when you tighten up the nuts, but we can see that's quite thin there, and also it's not really compliant anymore, it's really stiff and old and brittle. And then if we compare that with one of the new ones, slightly thicker there and nice and flexible. And what we're going to do is put some grease around these edges to help seal them, and we're also going to run the nuts up and down the studs on the oil cooler and the one from the case there, and then put a bit of grease on there as well, just to assist with putting them back together again, because they are so difficult to get to. And as with the brake cleaner that we've used plenty of on this job, the grease is available from Just Kampers online. So we'll put a bit of grease on the threads here, and then put some round the seating surface again. Now be careful, once this grease is on, it will attract dirt and grit onto there, and you don't want any of that at this stage. So we're happy with where the seals are, and we can now put it in place. And again, we'll loosely do up this one first, and then that'll allow us to get to the other ones without it falling over and off. Okay, the last thing to do is to put those two little M6 bolts on from underneath after balancing the washers on. It's a difficult job, so I'm going to stuff a bit of rag down in between the two barrels, so that if I do drop one, it won't go too far, and concentrate. Hopefully it will go well, and I'll catch you in a minute. Well, that took about 10 minutes of patience on there. Now what I was doing was going round, semi-tightening up one, moving on to the next one, and then just going round in three. Now if you over-tighten these, you could snap one of these studs, which would be a disaster. However, if you didn't tighten it up enough, this would be loose and you wouldn't have the proper seal. You will feel it go tight, and also you can always look down the side and you'll see that the seal's down there, and it will just squash ever so slightly, but it's quite obvious how it tightens up. And the last thing, if you did follow my advice and put a bit of rag down in case you dropped either the nuts or the washers, remember to pull that rag out, otherwise you'll seize your engine. As all the best manuals say, reassembly is the reversal of disassembly, but there are a few tricks we need to learn along the way. Now one thing to look out for is that you haven't bent this rod on the way down. There is supposed to be a bend on the end, and actually we can see some rubbish on the end of there. We'll contend with that just before we put the bellows on, but there's a tiny little slot that you need to slot this down, so that's the first thing to watch out for. And bearing in mind we're guiding the alternator past the carburettor, making sure the HT leads are out of the way, and it's just literally got to go down inside there, and of course slot it over the top of the oil cooler. Again, if you've got a friend, it might be easier. And one thing we have to watch out for is to make sure that this goes down on the inside, so you might have to lift it up and tip it and go down. And again, if it gets stuck, you can just use a flat bladed screwdriver just to ease it down. Oh, there we go. A couple of things to watch out for when you're putting it down. Just make sure that your strap is actually up against the backing plate there. Your HT leads aren't getting stuck in the way. And again, this is the early system that has this cable on here, which we'll reroute in a moment, but it's most unlikely you'll see one of those. Other than that, take your time, be careful, and there is a chance if your fan housing's been off in the past that your tinware may be damaged around the edges. Yep. So you may want to use a pair of pliers or mole grips and just straighten all that up before you actually drop your fan housing in. So we've made sure the fan housing is sitting down into the tinware correctly, and we've actually tightened those nuts up so everything's good, and then we can finally just move the bracket along, and you'll find it will hold its previous shape, so it's just a case of wiggling it along, getting it into position, One of the reasons we didn't take the nut right off was so that we can just leave it there ready for reassembly. Locate the nut on the spanner underneath on the ring portion. It's in. And then simply tighten it up. One thing I did forget, you might as well reconnect your electrics back onto the coil now whilst everything's easily accessible. So to recap then, we put the screws back into the fan housing to secure them into the cylinder head tin. Then we did up the alternator bracket. All we need to do now is put the HT leads back into the little plastic lugs, put the fan belt on, and then we can put the bellows on. Now we can do that after cleaning up the little rod. Remember there was some debris on there, by tilting the engine up as I did earlier, or if you want you can leave it till the engine's back in place and do it from underneath the vehicle. Okay, it's a much cleaner area to be working in now because we've spent all that time cleaning it. That second-hand toothbrush came in useful. We're going to fit the bellows here, and it's a case of slotting it up behind the push rod tubes, pushing it onto the end very gently of the threaded bar, and again I've already cleaned up the thread there, and just a case of a bit of patience and nice and gently turning it round till it takes hold. Once it's in there, give it a few spins, and there are two flats on the bottom of the bellows which you can fit a 13mm spanner over, and then you pick up your securing bolt from underneath, M8 13mm headed bolt. Pop that in, and then you can just tighten it up. And it is worth referring to your manual specific for your car for the actual settings on that bellows. And the last job underneath here is to replace the cover plate. So we just slot it in. It goes from above at the back there because it's captivated on here. And just put the first one in so that it's loose, then you can go and line up all the others. You don't need to see the rest of this job because it really is very straightforward. Yeah. The final part of reinstalling a fan housing then is to remember to fit the accelerator cable guide conduit. And there is actually still a grommet on that fan housing, which is unusual. It's a case of rotating it round and giving it a push. So once it's clear of the carburettor, we push it forwards, just a gentle wiggle, don't try and force it. Line it up with the slot in the back bulkhead. Now one top tip here, especially if you haven't got the grommet on the front, is actually to put a Jubilee clip or a couple of zip ties around here, just to clamp it up against there to prevent the whole thing sliding forwards with the action of the throttle cable and jamming your carburettor linkage. If you ever have a sticky accelerator pedal, that could be the cause. So that's it then, we've successfully completed that job. The oil cooler stand seals. Now whilst we did the job with the early style fan housing where the oil cooler was inside, the seals are in exactly the same place on a later case. It's just you have the adapter onto the oil cooler that you'll be replacing the seals on, but otherwise exactly the same job. We only needed to use tools from the basic toolkit, and of course the seals were from Just Kampers, possibly the most amount of work for the cheapest parts you'll ever fit. All that degreasing, I'm sure it was worthwhile really.